right, we'll go ahead and get started here. So hi everyone. First, I just want to mention at the top here, we did registration a little bit differently than we usually do. And so a link went out that was actually the panelist link. So please make sure that when you join and you access the space, it says that you are an attendee. If not, we'll need you to log off and use the link that was provided when you registered through Zoom. So we love you all dearly, but if you are logging on as a panelist, we are just going through and removing those folks. And I have sent an email out to everyone who registered with the corrected link. So apologies about that. Thank you so much for bearing with us. Technology is always super fun. Also, I hope everyone enjoyed the Benito Bowl on Sunday. We were playing some Bad Bunny at the top here to get us excited for the first GIA webinar of the year, which is our annual research on support for arts and culture. My name is Jamie Sharp, and I am the senior program manager here at Grantmakers in the Arts. I use she, they, or any pronouns, and I'm a light-skinned Black person. My hair is braided and up today, and I'm wearing a colorful collared shirt. GIA is headquartered on the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. We ask you to join in acknowledging the Lenape and Wappinger communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. A couple of reminders before we begin. Today's webinar will be recorded and shared. And before we begin, just take a minute to review the Zoom features so that you have an optimal experience with us today. If you have a question for our technical team during the webinar, you can feel free to either DM myself or LGC Tech Jess. Otherwise, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to the presenters. We will have time at the end for folks to ask their questions. If you would like your experience to include live captioning, select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. GIA's annual Arts Funding Snapshot is now available on the GIA Reader, featuring foundation grants to arts and culture 2023 based on the most recent completed year of Candid data prepared by Stephen Lawrence, and public funding for the arts 2025 prepared by the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. How have things changed since GIA's last funder snapshots between February and October 2025, and what can we look forward to in 2026? We also want to acknowledge that there are active changes afoot in the funding landscape at the federal level that impact many funders, and the data presented today will highlight the significance of funding at every level of government and public-private collaboration to support cultural funding. Today, we will hear from consultant Stephen Lawrence and also Mohja Rhoads, the research director at the National Assembly of States Arts Agencies, and Nakyung Rhee, research manager from National Assembly of States Arts Agencies. And without further ado, I will pass it to Stephen.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And for those, I will just note I'm a white man, shaved head, glasses, with pictures and art from family and friends. I'm thrilled to be presenting the latest data for the Arts Funding Snapshot, which you can access via the resources section of the GIA website. I've always appreciated how the commitment of grantmakers in the arts to really understanding and using data to inform what's happening in the arts and culture community. And I will, in fact, note as I was preparing for this, I was thinking it's actually been 35 years since I first worked on a research project with grantmakers in the arts. So definitely we go back together a ways. Well, that said, let's talk about what we're seeing in the data. Okay, if the slide is not advancing, so if you could advance to the next slide for me, please. Thank you. So we're presenting data from Candid's Foundation 1000 grants data set. If you'll click again, please. Alrighty, so this is all of the grants of $10,000 or more awarded by 1,000 of the largest US foundations. Clearly, there are over 100,000 grant-making US foundations, so this is a small subset, but because they are the largest, they account for about 2/5 of giving by all US private and community foundations. And as you can see, this totaled well over 200,000 grants, equaling roughly $62 billion in 2023. And I want to certainly acknowledge and thank my friends at Candid for providing these data. And also just to note that while this is not a comprehensive data set, it's certainly the most comprehensive data available on foundation grant making. All righty, next slide, please. So first off, we're going to look at the change in share of giving for arts and culture from 2010 to 2023. And I've sort of kept that baseline because you can see how pronounced the decrease in share of foundation funding for arts and culture has been during this period. Certainly, the 2010 data, that was an exceptional year where you had $1 billion commitment from the Walton Family Foundation to Crystal Bridges. By comparison, the largest grant we're seeing for the arts and culture in 2023 was a $75 million award. So we've gone from even, post, you can see the sort of steady decrease in share of funding. Basically the share was about 13 to 14% through the first half of the 2000. It dropped below 12% by the time of the Great Recession, which was around 2008. So we're at roughly half that share. A point I want to make as well is in recent years, Candid changed its methodology. So prior to about 2020, or actually a little earlier, they were counting grants data based on a primary grant purpose. Now they count based on primary or secondary grant purposes. So my expectation is that 6%, if it were the same methodology as was used in, say, the first half of this chart, it might actually be closer to 5%. All right, if we could have the next slide, please. Here now we show the change in share of number of grants. This has also decreased, although a little more gradually. We saw a rapid dip in 2019 and 2020. And of course, this reflected the strong increase in number of grants being awarded during the early beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So basically, you had foundations making a lot of exceptional grants on top of their regular grant making, which were not necessary, most of which were not specific to arts and culture. And so, that's reflecting that dip. In fact, in the latest year, we did see a slight uptick in share. So it's about where it was in 2021. But nonetheless, it's well below where we started from if you look back to 2010 and even look back to as recently as 2018. Next slide, please. Now we want to take a look at actual grant dollars accounted for in the Foundation 1000 set for arts and culture. So you can see the dollars have gone up from about 2.4 billion in 2010 to 4 billion in 2023. So, looks like quite, not a bad increase, definite growth. But let's take a look at this adjusted for inflation. So if you turn to the next slide, all right, there you see it's actually over this time period been about a $400 million increase in funding for arts and culture after inflation. You saw that we were about that same level in 2021, we dipped in 2022, and we're back up to 2.8 inflation adjusted dollars in 2023. What I want you to keep in mind, though, is during this same time period, overall grant dollars awarded for all purposes by foundations included in the Foundation 1000 doubled, just slightly more than doubled during this period after inflation. So what this means is that if giving for arts and culture had retained a consistent share of funding during this period, the figure we'd be looking at inflation adjusted instead of being 2.8 billion would be 5 billion. So so instead of that, we're looking at what would have been about a $2.6 billion increase rather than a $400 million increase after inflation, a very substantial difference. So I like to reference the Arts Funding at 25 report I worked on for Grantmakers in the Arts a few years ago, where we looked at some of the potential factors accounting for this decreasing share. And what we saw was there wasn't real attrition in terms of funders leaving arts funding, but rather that the share of their allocations that were focused on arts and culture had decreased. The other key factor was that for foundations established in the 1990s, about 80% funded the arts. For those established in earlier decades, the shares were even higher, whereas for foundations established from 2000 onward, the share was about 63%. And my expectation is if we look at foundations established even more recently by decade, that share would be even lower. And I actually will talk a bit more about this when we talk about corporate funding for the arts. But let's first take a look at a matched set of funders in the next slide. So of the 1,000 foundations, 859 had provided grants data for both 2022 and 2023 that Candid had access to. So looking at the chart on the left, you can see that overall grant dollars in the set increased 9% during this period, while arts giving only increased 1%, which is why we're seeing, that continued decrease in share. Now, interestingly enough, in change in number of grants, overall number of grants included in the set was down by about 1%, whereas arts giving, the number of grants that were awarded were up by about 2%. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at giving by type of foundation. And I always find this so interesting because in 2010, corporate and operating foundations accounted for almost a quarter of giving for arts and culture. Community foundations were only about 4% of that total. Independent and family foundations clearly account for the vast majority of foundation funding for arts and culture. If we go to the next slide, we see that how dramatically that picture has changed. For community foundations, they have been a very important vehicle in terms of providing, being a source of funding for newly wealthy individuals. I mean, if you look at Silicon Community Foundation alone, the way that institution has grown over the past couple of decades, they're clearly an important vehicle for newer donors, wealthy donors who don't necessarily want to set up their own foundations or who want to set up funds for very specific purposes. What's most interesting to me is there's the operating piece. A large share of the operating piece was the J. Paul Getty Trust. So grant making they do, even though they're primarily operating their programs. But for corporate foundations, this I find really kind of fascinating. I've speculated about, the different factors that are influencing this trend. Certainly corporate foundations were critical for the growth of cultural institutions and communities across the US in the 20th century. The rise of corporate mergers in the 80s and 90s caused organizations to, in a sense, not be headquartered in the same cities, even though they may have operations there, removing those connections to communities. The offshoring of industries and of work, of manufacturing certainly has been a factor that has disconnected corporations from specific communities. And for those of you who may have seen it, last week in the Times, there was a really terrific piece, I thought, by Oren Cass of American Compass, which is a conservative think tank. And it was the piece was titled "The Finance Industry is a Grift. Let's Start Treating It That Way." And it actually made a larger point about how finance sector-led changes in the American economy has moved us away from growing businesses and made the point that in order for businesses to grow, you really have to have employees who are connected, communities that are connected. In a sense, you've got to have that local connection if you're growing business, whereas the financialization of our economy has really moved away from growing businesses to, more abstract financial manipulations that aren't growing businesses. So just kind of thinking about how that has had an impact, plus just the social cachet factor of being in communities. And it's something I think about in terms of the overall trend, the overall decreasing share of foundation support targeting arts and culture. To what extent the 20th century was about building arts and cultural institutions, and that in a sense, appreciation and connection to those institutions hasn't carried on to subsequent generations. Social capital is being built in different ways. These are just my speculations, of course. All right, if we can go on to the next slide, please. Just in terms of where the funding is going, over the time we've been looking at arts and culture, performing in arts and museums have sort of switched places at times in terms of which accounted for the largest share. I think this may be the first time I've seen a tie. And in fact, it's really been since the mid 2010s that we've seen museums account for as large a share of grant dollars or as performing arts. It's really been quite some time. But we had three major gifts in the latest grant set: a $75 million general support grant to the Smithsonian Institution from the WEM Foundation, which you may not have heard of. I didn't. I actually was one I wasn't familiar with and had to look it up. And in fact, it was sunsetting. So it was spending out its endowment. There was a $50 million general support grant from the David Geffen Foundation to the LA County Museum of Art, and a $400 million grant for various projects from the Aldara Foundation to the Museum of Flight. So several very substantial awards, which those are usually the factors that will account for museums matching performing arts in terms of share of grant dollars. By share of number of grants, performing arts far surpasses museums and other areas of arts and culture funding. I'll also note there's arts multipurpose, just to say that includes support for multidisciplinary arts centers, arts councils, artist services, arts administration, arts exchange, and arts education. And this share was fairly consistent with the prior year. And then in terms of other arts, I'll just note that there's a very substantial share of funding for arts and culture where you'll have a grant description that literally says for arts. And if it's going to performing arts center, then it'll be coded as performing arts. If it's not quite clear what it's for, if it's going for to a university for arts, it would be coded as other arts. So just to explain why that share is so high. All right, if I could have the next slide, please. So here we just want to take a look at funding by type of support strategy. One of the points of pride, I think, for the foundation arts supporting community is the very substantial share that is awarded as unrestricted support. And here you can see in the blue bars, the share of grant dollars that are unrestricted is a third. Share of number of grants, it's more than a third. It's almost 2 out of every 5 grants are providing unrestricted support. And this compares to about a quarter of grant dollars across issue areas and about 30% of grants by share of number of grants. So the arts is definitely, there was a real impetus to provide more unrestricted support to the arts, and that has really continued. It grew and it's continued to be an important priority for the Foundation Arts funding community. Program support, the Candid changed its programming recently. These shares program support used to count for the largest share of funding. Now it's a much more modest share. I think I've asked some questions about this. I think this is being explored. It may have been overcoded in the past. It's hard to say, but this just if you're someone who remembers the numbers from last year, which may be unlikely, but you never know. This is a bit unusual. And then in terms of capital and infrastructure support, it's interesting. It's about 12% of grant dollars funded buildings, renovations, equipment, could be, for costumes, a whole range of purchasing art. This share, as I say, it's about 12%, but that compares to about 5% of foundation funding overall. So it's definitely the arts is capturing a larger share of capital and infrastructure support. All right, next slide, please. So there's much, much more to be explored in the art snapshot. I'm really excited to hear your questions about trends in funding. But now I will turn you to Mohja and Nakyung, who will talk about state arts funding, state and local.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone. Well, just let me jump into our presentation. And let me test my screen. Okay. Okay, so my role in this segment is to focus on the public funding resources that support the art grant making. Mohja, our research director at NASA, will share in detail soon. I'll share the total public arts funding across federal, state, and local levels, highlight changes in FY25, and preview what we are seeing for FY 2026. And the fiscal year 2025 has been characterized as a year of recalibration, and that word choice is deliberate. After the extraordinary pandemic era investments that have sustained operation and served communities during the unprecedented time, we observed art funding level moderate while remaining higher than pre-pandemic baseline. And here's the current landscape. The total public art funding across all three levels of government stands at about $1.68 billion for FY 2025. And let me break that down by level. Okay, I'm not sure the slide is working. Okay, thank you. First, at the federal level, the National Endowment for the Arts received $207 million for FY25, the same as FY24. The fiscal year began under a continuing resolution, a temporary funding measures that keeps spending at the prior year's level when Congress hasn't enacted a full budget. While the dollar amount stayed flat, operating under a CR effect when grants could be processed and distributed. So once full year funding was enacted in March 2025, the NEA was able to move forward with its state partnerships and grant making. Okay. And at state level, FY25 legislative appropriations to the state art agencies totaled $687 million, an 8.5% decrease from previous year. This decline largely reflected adjustments in a few large budget states as pandemic relief allocations phased out. While the national total helped us to see overall directions, state reality vary widely because appropriations reflect each state's economy, policy choice, and of course the budget cycles and many others. Oops, okay. I think I now have a control back. Thank you. The local government arts expenditure were estimated at $787.8 million, an 8.5% decrease, mirroring the state level trend. A note about this figure is comprehensive local art funding data has not been available since 2023. So to estimate FY24 and FY25, we apply the same percentage change observed in state appropriations to the last confirmed local total from Americans for the Arts from FY 2023, assuming the local funding followed a comparable trajectory. And local budgets are also tied with local revenue and priorities, and funding patterns can shift more quickly than federal and state policy and vary significantly from one state to county to the next. And while this decrease may raise concern, contact is important. Even with these declines, FY25 funding level remains above pre-2020 baseline. It looks like I'm losing my control again. Okay, thank you. Okay, the broader pattern is consistent with what many of you may observe or experience. The sector or the economy in general is moving away from pandemic era peaks toward more typical budgeting conditions, often with tighter fiscal constraints. So to truly understand today's funding environment, we need to zoom out and look at the broader trajectory. This visualization here shows federal, state, and local government art funding over the past 2 decades in both nominal and inflation-adjusted dollar. Notice the spike during the 2021 and 2023. Those peaks represent the federal relief package, including CARES Act funding and ARP Act investments. What's noteworthy is the baseline shift. Even as we move moderated from those peaks, current funding level demonstrate sustained public commitments that exceed pre-pandemic investments. This represents a new and higher baseline for public art support. Also, the inflation-adjusted view shown in the lighter bars provides additional context about purchasing power, which matter because costs rise. When appropriations are flat or declining in nominal term, the real capacity to deliver programs and services can shrink more than the headlines suggest. That can show up as fewer grants, smaller grants, or more pressure on staff and services, even when the funding level looks steady. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the combined picture as a recap across federal, state, and local level, current estimates place FY 2025 public art funding at $1.6 billion level, about $160 million less than FY 24 in nominal term. This is why we call FY 25 a year of recalibration. Funding is moderating from historic pandemic era highs while remaining elevated relative to the pre-pandemic norms. The system is still larger than it used to be, but is operating in more constrained environments than the peak relief years. Next slide, please. Okay, then let's translate this billion-dollar figure into something more tangible, the per capita investment. This metric helps us understand public art funding in relation to population size and provide another way to communicate scale at an individual level. For FY 2025, total public arts investment equals $4.99 per person. That's about 12% from federal sources, 41% from state sources, and 47% from local sources. And to put it in perspective, federal outlays in FY 2025 equated to about $433 per person for transportation and $211 per person for education and social services, while art funding is under $5 per person, not even about a cost of coffee. So these modest investments support cultural access and art programming across all communities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that was FY 25. And looking ahead to FY 2026, we have an update on federal funding. Since the publication of our report, the appropriations process has progressed. Congress has passed and the president has signed into law fiscal year 2026 funding for the National Endowment for the Arts at $207 million, the same amount from FY 24 and FY 25. This represents a change from earlier House proposals mentioned in our public funding for the art article. To provide extra context on how we arrived here, last year, the Executive Administration's budget request proposed eliminating NEA funding. Earlier in the process, the House proposed $135 million, and the Senate proposed maintaining funding at $207 million. The final enacted level of 207 represents the outcome of the legislative process. This funding level allows the NEA to continue its partnership agreement with state art agencies and support for art organizations nationwide. Next slide, please. Yeah, for state funding, projections for FY 2026 suggest continued moderations with an important nuance around line items. A line item is an earmarked appropriations designated for a particular institution's program or purpose. So it is a pass-through dollar that bypass the state art agency's general budget. Because line items don't reflect the core operating capacity of state art agencies, we look at projections both the way. Including line items, total state appropriations suggest around a 6% decline, while excluding line item, looking just at the base agency budget, projections suggest around a 2.5% increase. This distinction reflects how differently states structure their art funding. Some resources flow through flexible agency appropriations that support statewide grant making and services, while others are earmarked for specific institutions or initiatives. So understanding this structure is important for advocacy and partnership strategies. For more detailed state-by-state information, such information will be available in NASAA's FY 2026 revenue report, which released this week. So please visit our website if you'd like to explore your state-specific situations and information. Next slide, please. Okay. So what do these patterns tell us? First, the system is interconnected. Federal, state, and local dollar reinforce one another to sustain art infrastructure nationwide. Second, we are in a distinct post-pandemic period. Funding is moderating from extraordinary peaks, but stabilizing at level above pre-2020 baseline. The trend is recalibration, not retreat. So that's my overview for FY 26. And I'll now turn it over to Mohja.
Thank you, Nakyung. Let me see if I can. Oh, it looks like I can move with the slides myself. Thank you very much, Nakyung. My name is Mohja Rhoads. I'm the research director at NASAA, the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. Nakyung just presented on funding trends, and I will go into where these funds are going, how they're going into grant making. And I'm looking at the period 2019 to 2024, so basically pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And we have, in terms of grant data, a really nice data set right now where we've been looking at individual grant programs over this period of time. And so this is what we have data for, and I decided to look at this time period and also to assess how the pandemic affected the grant-making landscape. Was it just kind of a hit and run, an influx of cash, an influx of grant-making, and then lowering back down to levels before the pandemic, or are we at a higher baseline? And the story is that we're at a higher baseline overall, which also means that we have a more robust arts infrastructure now. And to orient you to our website where you can find most of these grant-making fact sheets, you can go up to top, the tab Research, and click on grant making, and you can find all of those fact sheets here. We only have the most recent fact sheet posted to our website, but if you are interested in the more historical ones from prior years, you can reach out to either Nakyung or me. So it looks like I've lost control now. Thank you. So just very briefly discussing how the three levels of government interact, and they do very substantially. Federal dollars go to state partnership funds, and federal dollars also go to local communities in terms of grants. And then the state regrants their funds to the local level, and all three levels interact on a leadership role. So it's very important to assess all three levels and understand how they're working and consider the whole public landscape. We, of course, because we work with state arts agencies, have data on states. That's our robust data set. So the federal and the local level, we cover, but our most substantial data come at the state level. Next slide, please. So overall trends in grant making from 2019 to 2024, pre and post-pandemic, is that post-pandemic grant making has stabilized at a higher baseline across all three levels, federal, state, and local. And what this means is that states are focusing on infrastructure. So it wasn't just about it, or hasn't just been about a temporary relief. It's about a more stable, higher system overall. So the trends indicate that we have elevated funding for grant making. There's been increased grant making, increased median award sizes, sustained geographic reach, and continued prioritization of rural and underserved communities post-pandemic. The programs vary year to year, but the overall picture shows continuity rather than retrenchment. And these findings really underscore the role of public arts funding as a national cultural infrastructure that leverages federal scale, state coordination, and local implementation to ensure access, resilience, and long-term public value. Next slide, please. So in terms of the federal landscape, I summarized 5 years of their quick facts. The NEA publishes 2-page quick facts each year. They're very lovely. You can go to their website and find those. And so over this 5-year landscape for which they have these quick facts, we've shown that it's just shown that grant volume has risen and stabilized at around 2,400 grants per year. And the NEA continues to really make underserved communities a priority. In high poverty, those communities are high poverty communities and rural communities. And as you all may or may not know, 60% of the NEA program funds go to local communities through direct grants and 40% go to partnership grants. But overall funding has risen and stabilized at higher volumes in terms of grant making. Next slide, please. Now moving on to the state landscape for which NASAA has a pretty robust data set. The trends here show, as I said before, that SAAs across all these grant programs that we collect information for, SAAs have increasingly balanced breadth and depth, maintaining broad geographic access while providing more stabilized and flexible funding. And this is being shown in higher median awards across most grant programs and sustained increase in grant making overall in most programs. And so this evolution positions public arts funding as distinct from private and philanthropic sources, which are often project restricted, geographically concentrated, or tied to donor priorities. So states really serve a critical role because they're accountable to communities throughout their states, and they're designed to address gaps in access, capacity, and equity. Next slide, please. So general operating support trends in grant making. The GOS is a cornerstone of state arts agency grant making. Around a third of all SAA grant dollars go to general operating support, which is, as I said before, a cornerstone of state art agency grant making and very important because GOS provides unrestricted funding to organizations, sometimes being a lifeline to smaller organizations. So overall, GOS funding has risen and settled at a higher baseline, even as emergency relief has tapered. So 2024 shows a higher baseline than pre-pandemic levels. And the composition, interestingly, has shifted towards fewer and larger grants. So as we can see on the chart on the right, the median award size has grown since before the pandemic. And as I said before, it's a critical role SAAs play because it really becomes lifelines for organizations. It's particularly small and mid-sized. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite visuals from the report and also just in general because it shows the broad swath of grant making across the United States. And this graphic is split between, or the two different colors are large and small organizations. And we really can see how the small organization grant making reaches most corners of all states. Very lovely visual. And this is GOS awards. And so while funding for the larger organizations has grown, and it's still a larger percentage than smaller organizations, the majority of grants go to smaller organizations. So 75% of the GOS grant making goes to smaller organizations. All right, next slide. So rural grant making programs also look very good. In 2024, state arts agency grant making to rural areas remains above pre-pandemic levels and above even pandemic levels. While the share has remained relatively stable, total funding and meeting award sizes have both increased, enabling deeper and more durable support. And these patterns highlight the distinct function of public funding in addressing geographic disparities, which is very important because private and philanthropic arts funding is often concentrating in urban centers. And state arts agencies are dedicated and mandated to reach all corners of their states. Next slide, please. So individual artists, a little bit of a different pattern here, but still significant. Total funding for artists increased significantly during the pandemic. But it's still, 2024 still remains above 2020 levels. And while individual artist grants represent a small share of total SAA grant dollars, they represent a large number of awards. So lots of awards are given. They're just small in nature. And so even as funding levels have fluctuated year to year, the number of communities served by individual artist grants continues to grow, reinforcing place-based equity as a core policy objective. All right, next slide, please. Arts education. State arts agency investment in arts education has nearly doubled since pre-pandemic years, and it remains at a new higher baseline in 2024. Although it represents a smaller share of total grant dollars, that's due to growth across other programs. Absolute investments are significantly higher, and median award sizes have also increased substantially. So grant making patterns increase fewer larger awards with median grant sizes more than doubling over time. And this shift signals a move away from short-term project-based funding towards more stable investments that sustain educational infrastructure, workforce capacity, and long-term access for students statewide. Next slide, please. Last but not least, local arts agency funding. While we don't have data on the overall grant making of local arts agencies, what we do have data on is how SAAs give to local arts agencies. And so over this period of time, state arts agency funding to local arts agencies has increased substantially, rising from about 37 million to about 68 million. And across this period of time, local arts agencies have remained a stable and targeted part of state arts agency grant making, and they consistently represent about 5 to 6% of all grants by number. Median award size has stabilized at roughly $10,000 after 2022, and the number of communities served has expanded compared to fiscal year 2019, underscoring their continuing role as local cultural infrastructure. And then my last slide. Next slide. Oh, here we go. And where are because we have data on where the activities funded, and the bulk is through regranting and also operating support. During the pandemic period, operating support became the most prominent, notably in FY 2021, reflecting stabilization priorities. But over this time period, LAA support shows continuity rather than disruption in the reach of activities, even as funding levels have increased and geographic reach has expanded. All right. That is it. I have one last slide just showing, that's okay. It was showing some resources and websites.
And we will be sure to send out all the presentation slides to everyone that's has registered, so they will have access to that. Thank you so much, Mohja, Nakyung, and Stephen. We're going to move on into our Q&A. I do want to highlight Nakyung answered one of these. There was a question about Kansas not having as a state any general operating support grants. And Nakyung said that a full set of Kansas general operating support grants data will be available after fiscal year 2026. Grant cycle concludes due to an extended grantee reporting period. So I'm going to hop around a bit so we can kind of go back and forth here. But there's a question about which sectors are receiving the largest share of grant funds and which sectors are benefiting the most from the increase in giving.
I'm not sure if I can answer what sectors, but in terms, as I said before, most of the grant, and this is in terms of the states, most of the grant making is going to general operating support. So it's going to programs that fund a variety of organizations, and their general operating support. More detailed than that, we don't know. These data are collected through FDRs, and that level of detail is not known there. But individual states may have done research on that. So that would be actually an interesting ChatGPT question.
And Stephen, did you have any insights from the other side of that?
The only point I'll make is really about, in a sense, the stability of funding coming through the pandemic in terms of priorities. With every time there's a crisis, the question is, will funders completely change to supporting human services or health or some other immediate need? And the reality is the giving they do is always exceptional giving. Foundations have determined their priorities. They're focused. They have many reasons for focusing on those priorities, and those have remained largely consistent. I think we see that in the data.
There's a question here for you, Stephen. For the giving from community foundations, what is the source of these funds? Are the grants coming from DAFs? Are community foundations acting as fiscal sponsors for local government or foundation investment?
Not necessarily fiscal sponsors. So the Candid data is reflecting unrestricted giving by community foundations. Basically, that's coming from income generated by their endowments or just by unrestricted gifts to the institutions, and from donor advised funds. Donor restricted funds, funds that were set up to only ever say support a specific organization, are not being counted. So a large share of that giving is coming from donor advised funds. Now, the question is, it may vary for the donors between those who say, I want to support the arts and culture, and I trust you as an institution to make those decisions, to know the community, versus those who say, I'm on the board of the symphony, or, we go to the opera, or we've gone to the opera for years, and I want those dollars to support those. So it's going to be a mix. I mean, in terms of it providing government support, or being sort of affiliated with government, I think that, I mean, I can't say never, but I think that would be a very rare and unusual circumstance. There may be some alignment in funding. For example, if local government and the community foundation and other funders are supporting a new cultural institution or renovation, things like that, there may be alignment, but not something that the community foundation itself would control.
Got it. Thank you. And this is for Mohja and Nakyung. How is state and or local funding impacted by the potential level of federal funding? Are the state arts agencies and local arts agencies able to self-administer funding within their jurisdictions independently of changing guidance from the federal level?
So yes, they are absolutely able to do that. The only requirement from federal funding is that their level of their award is matched at the state level. So that's the only requirement. But They are absolutely able to operate independently. And how are they being affected? Well, so far, the show has been the same. It's been the same. Funding has stayed stable and consistent. And the picture definitely varies from state to state. So if there were to be no federal funding, you would have many states that would they would lose half of their budget. But you have also many states that will operate perfectly, will operate as continued, would be a minor change for them. Um, but so far, it's been so good, and it looks like we're going to have continued stable funding at the federal level, at least within the next couple of years. So the situation looks actually quite good.
Thank you. And then our next question here, can the speakers reflect on the observation that public funding seems to have sustained a higher baseline of giving, while foundation giving has not maintained levels post-pandemic? Any considerations for the field's advocacy of private sector institutions or lessons applicable from public to private?
I think that question goes to Stephen because I'm not necessarily sure that's what I saw.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is when you look even for the inflation adjusted dollars, but certainly for that nominal dollar figure, from 2.4 billion to 4 billion just for this set of large funders, there's more money there. So it's not necessarily obvious that the arts hasn't kept pace with other areas of foundation grant making. So I think that's a big factor. I mean, it's interesting to me, and I've made this point, I think the last few webinars I've participated in with grant makers in the arts. The arts and culture are so essential to social change. And I think there's not necessarily, despite the best efforts of organizations like grant makers in the arts, that connection has not necessarily been made to a new generation of donors. I think another factor that's really interesting is the way philanthropy is happening now versus, say, in the 1980s, when you may have had, individuals who were nearing retirement age, who had amassed wealth, who created an institute, a foundation as part of their estate planning. You have younger, wealthier donors who are using multiple vehicles to execute their philanthropy. There are different, the perspective in terms of having control over that decision making, that is different. And we've all heard about kind of the greater reliance on wealthier donors. That there isn't as the smaller donors are accounting for a relatively smaller share. And what's a smaller donor within the foundation community? I mean, that may be a foundation that gives $500,000 a year or $1 million a year versus kind of the biggest institutions. But my question is, some of this is going to be a change. The focus on the environment, focus on health, all of those things really rose over the last few years. You go back to the 1950s, foundations were spending a substantial share of their funding on social sciences and really building those institutions. And then you saw that it got institutionalized. Government grant making was there to support it, so there was less of a need. So I have to say, I've actually really appreciated Mohja and Nakyung's presentation talking about how strong and stable federal, state, and local arts funding is, because I think that's really important. I will say, though, I think this is a moment where there's a real opportunity for organizations to take a look at what they're doing and to closely assess, like, how has our mission crept? Where do we need to narrow in? And if what we're doing takes a lot of human capital and a lot of financial capital for not necessarily a lot of impact. I mean, this goes beyond the arts. This may be the moment to really sort of reassess and say, how do we really narrow our focus, to critical priorities?
Yeah, thank you. And we'll do one last question here. And don't worry, folks, if your question was not answered, we'll share it with our panelists offline. And then when I send a follow-up email to everyone, we'll have written responses there. But it's great to hear that overall there is more robust funding, and it's not what we are hearing from community-based arts organizations. I'm trying to make sense of different narratives. Any thoughts? Is it really so rosy?
I'm sorry, I'm like able to read the questions. Can you repeat that one?
Yeah, no worries. And I will drop it in the chat for everyone as well. It's great to hear that overall there is more robust funding. And contrast to that, it's not what we're hearing from community-based arts organizations. I'm trying to make sense of different narratives. Any thoughts? Is it really so rosy?
I mean, it's very hard. That's the level where I don't get, I'm not in super contact with the local level. So I'm not necessarily hearing what's going on at the local level. But in terms of national and federal trends, it does look quite good and quite stable. There's, idiosyncratic changes with programs and, different budget processes going through different states. But we can, I mean, what we speak to is the broader scale trends. And this is just statistics 101. The more local you get, the noisier it gets and the more different it gets. And that's just what happens in any story that you drill down into a different level. And so I can't speak on broad local trends, but I can only speak on large general ones. And in the large general trend looks pretty robust, and we'll be here next year to tell you how it's going.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, we're looking at broad aggregates in all of our data. The reality is the large, well-established institutions with big fundraising staff, who are very connected to all types of different sources of support are going to weather any period and are going to do okay. The newer, smaller, scrappier organizations are going to struggle. And is this going to be a flush period? It's really hard to say. I mean, we talk in philanthropy about, like when's McKinsey Scott's check coming? It's sort of like you got the golden ticket, but the reality is that's a handful of really large organizations that are going to find that deep-pocketed donor who wants to support them and stick with them for a while. The question is, how are you building connection? My argument would be if you believe in your mission, you believe in what you're doing, and you really narrow in and focus on the core. And it's hard because, any small organization is going to be close to the ground and say, but we want to do this, but there's a need for this, and we want to present all these things, and we really want to kind of be able to do everything for everyone. That's going to make your work a lot harder in terms of, really building a sustainable financial model for your institution.
That's right. And I just want to dovetail on that a little bit. The patterns change from state to state too. So when we are looking at the national trends, everything gets watered out, but every year there will be a major change in a state, especially the bigger ones or even the smaller ones. And so these national patterns don't even translate to the particular state stories either. But where one state will have a large change one year, that state will then rise and another state will fall. And so they all tend to average each other out. So yes, it changes from national to state to local. And that's how the world works. So
Yeah. So you're not imagining things.
yeah, no.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. Today's webinar provided valuable insights into the latest findings on support for arts and culture, shedding light on funding trends, gaps, and opportunities within the field. By analyzing these data-driven perspectives, we can better understand how resources are distributed and identify ways to advance more equitable and sustainable investment in the arts. GIA remains committed to equipping the philanthropic sector with knowledge and tools to foster a funding landscape prioritizing racial equity, cultural vitality, and community-centered impact. Together, we can ensure that arts and culture thrive through informed, strategic, and justice-centered support. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to our technician today, Jess. We encourage you to provide us with feedback about your experience, either by using the QR code that's about to pop up on the screen or through the survey link in the chat. And as a reminder, all webinar registrants will receive a follow-up email with resources from our speakers, including their slides, links to the publications that we have now on the reader. And we will also follow up. We got many, many questions, so we will follow up with the responses from our panelists on those. And I thank you all so much for joining us. Take care.